Okay, well, welcome everybody. I apologize for the delay in getting that going, but sometimes I have those technical difficulties, right? I think we all experience those from time to time. But tonight we're going to talk about the standard residential lease. And you guys can see that screen, right? With the uh, says standard residential lease on there.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thanks for that. So, welcome. This lease I wrote over the years of being in the property management business. So this is something that I've put together over trial and time. Some of this may be overkill. Some of what I cover you might not want in your lease. But what I always figure is be prepared for the worst, right? I've had my legal counsel take a look at this and make some edits and make some changes. But here's what I always suggest to people. Regardless of what I say, make sure that you go to your own accountant, your own attorney for information. I'm not an accountant, nor am I an attorney. All I do is convey information that I've gathered from over the years of my own real estate experience and knowledge. It's kind of like, and putting this together and having this lease put together, it's kind of like going to UL Laboratories or the FDA for an inspection or a report where you're going to be able to get some type of an approval. So I always tell people, check with your local attorney, check with your local accountant, make sure your state and county guidelines or city guidelines are right in line with everything that we talk about. So when we start to look at the residential lease, and there's a number of pages, and I talked about this being overkill, it's about 10 pages long. And your standard lease probably doesn't need to be that long, but what I have found over time and over the years is the fact that something will happen with a tenant. And when something happens with a tenant, you decide, oh, I probably need to put that clause in the lease just in case that ever happens again. And things kind of grow as a result of that. It was the same thing when I was in the construction business. We would have a problem on a job or have an issue with a homeowner. And what we'd wind up doing is adding another paragraph to the back of our contract because we didn't want that to happen again. Or if it happened again, we wanted to be prepared for it. So the front page of your standard lease is going to really just look like this. And the first couple pages we go through, I've split these pages up. So this is the top half. But it's going to start with your lease beginning date and your lease ending date. Very important data, right? And how much the rent is and what the security deposit is that you're going to get. Then when we put the information in for the tenants, we want to make sure that the information on the front page is going to line up with the information on the back page. And it's very important that you get all the information because if there's ever a problem with the tenant, you want to be able to find the tenant down the road. But these are our starting points. The first thing that we look at, now this is the second half of this first page, is the definitions. And what we talk about here is wherever this lease, the following terms, landlord. Landlord represents the owner. Property manager, same as landlord. Owner, operator, all these terms all mean the same individual or responsible for the lease and the terms that are in the lease. But what we do is we go through and we put together mutual covenants that are going to be, pretty much we want to try and create some type of a win-win for the tenant as well as for the owner, right? And as a manager or a landlord, you are the person that could be representing the owner. There's several different ways to get into the management business, right? You might be a landlord for yourself by default because you own a property or wound up with a property. You might be a landlord or you're an investor and have bought your own property, or you might own a property management company or decide that that's a way that you want to go. But in the lease here, we want to talk about the unit itself, what the dwelling consists of, how many parking spaces or garage, carports, transmitters, things like that. And then appliances. Do appliances come with the property? I've managed property in the Illinois market, the Chicago market, and we typically supply all the appliances there. But then if I go to Texas or Indiana and I have property in those markets, generally those units do not come with washers and dryers and stoves and refrigerators. tenants tend to bring that stuff themselves. And I know different parts of the country bring different types of appliances to the units. Now we go on and we want to talk about the lease term, how long the resident is going to be there. Now, I always like to sign a 12-month lease. I feel that a 12-month lease gives you a little bit more security. You know that person's going to be there. I know that there's people who like month-to-month type leases, and I've got a good friend. We get in some good conversations about that month-to-month versus 12-month lease terms. And then there's the security deposit. Security deposit's important, and you need to be aware of it. In your market, like in the Chicago market, you may be responsible for paying interest. Security deposits generally need to be kept in a separate escrow account and need to be outside of your operating account. And I believe that the law in most places states that if you own 6 units or more, those security deposits need to be in a separate escrow account. Then we have a line item for any separate accounts or separate deposits, maybe a pet deposit or an extra security deposit. I know I've had people move into properties where their credit was just a little shaky and I asked for 2 months security deposit instead of just 1. So you want to state those types of things. And then we want to go into the rent and when the rent is due and exactly how much the rent is. Now this space here will tell if there's any additional rents. Maybe you have additional rent for a pet that might be on the property. Maybe you offer storage to your tenant and there's additional rent for that storage or parking spots. I used to love to create additional revenue for the apartments that I owned by adding a parking spot near the front door that tenants could pay for. You'd be surprised how many tenants want to park right by the front door and are willing to pay $25 or $50 a month to live in that spot. Let's talk about prorating the rent. You know, if a tenant moves in the middle of the month, we want to make sure that we are prorating that rent. So if the rent's $1,000, they move in the middle of the month, they're going to give you $500 for the rest of that month, correct? And then in the first of the month, we start that cycle over again where they pay the full month's rent. The reason I like to collect rents on the first of the month is because I'm consistent then with everybody in my units across the board. I don't want to be collecting rents on the 15th, the 5th, or the 27th of the month from different tenants. The other thing that I like to set up in my lease is a staggered payment. And I talk about this in this prorated rent section. But let's say that your rent is $1,000 and you have a tenant and you offer your tenant, hey, listen, if you pay your rent 5 days in advance, I'm willing to give you a $25 discount. So instead of paying $1,000, you'll pay $975. But the opposite is true too. If you're 5 days late, I'm going to charge a $25 late fee. So now your rent becomes $1,025. So what I try to do is I try to work with my tenants and get all my rents in early and not have to deal with collection problems and collection issues. But if somebody's consistently late and they're paying that extra $25 a month, you know, can tend to be some good revenue for you. And let's talk about late fees for a minute. Now, when those tenants are late, I very rarely will give grace on that $25. The 5th day, if that rent is not paid in full, I will go ahead and charge that extra $25. And then if we have to take it out of security deposits at the end of the lease term, I've done that in the past as well. One of the things I want you to notice about this lease is at the bottom of every page, there's room for initials. And I tend to meet with my tenants when I move them in the property. Or you can do it online. You know, Zoom is a great way to be building relationships with tenants and be going through paperwork. You can go through a lease online with a tenant. They can electronically sign everything, electronically initial everything, and then you can just exchange everything electronically, right? You could leave a lockbox on the property and they could get a key. A lot of times you might want to do that move out or move in or move out inspection in order to complete that part of the process. But you can always go over the lease and the terms online with someone. But I always have these tenants Initial at the bottom of the page. Another very important part is I always make sure that if I have a critical point I want to talk to my tenant about, like the terms or the rents, that I talk to them about it, and then I have them initial in the margin. And by initialing in the margin, it really stands up if there's a problem and you ever wind up in fair housing court over any issues. The standard residential lease also, we talk about rents that are due and utility services. A lot of times you might offer paid utilities, but in many cases, the tenant's responsible for the utilities. If I have a unit, single family home, townhouse, even a small multifamily, where the tenant is responsible for the utilities, be it electric or gas, I make sure that they go and they pay any deposits that are due and bring the deposit to me at the time of signing the lease. So I have a copy of that receipt in their file. The other thing that's really important is if you as the owner stay on the account or stay on the notification from the utility company, so that you will always be notified if that tenant runs 30 days behind on their utility. Generally, when a tenant is starting to experience problems with paying rent or utilities, it happens at the utility level before it gets to the rent. So a lot of times you might know ahead of time that a tenant is starting to experience those rent difficulties or payment difficulties, and they will hold off on paying late rents, and you'll find out because of the utilities. And then one last thing on the utility section is, as an owner of multifamily, in most cases, you're going to be responsible for the water and the sewer bill. Most cases, villages are going to have you pay a deposit for that water and that sewer. And that deposit is generally held until you don't own the building anymore. Even if the tenant puts down a deposit, that city or village will typically keep your water deposit. Evictions. Evictions are something that I am very stringent on. I do not really waiver at all. If I have a tenant that is 20 days late on their rent, I immediately serve them a 5-day notice. If at the end of that 5th day, if they haven't caught up, I serve that 10-day notice and I go directly to the courthouse and file. The reason for that is typically if they're 20 days behind, the thought of them catching up becomes slimmer and slimmer. It gets harder and harder for them to put 2 months of rent together. Most of these tenants typically will live month to month. And if they start to fall behind, the further they fall behind, the more problems you have. The next point I talk about is subleasing or assigning a lease. A lot of times tenants might find a new job somewhere else and they need to move, or they want to go rent somewhere else, or they decide to move in with a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And what happens is they try to sublease their property. Make sure as an owner that you are approving a new tenant, a subletting tenant, the same way that you would approve your existing original tenant. Make sure that your tenants that are moving out are aware of your standards around that also. Possession. I always talk about possession. It's similar to a hold harmless because it protects the owner and the tenant both. Possession is when the tenant is giving up their rights any longer to the property. So that's when they move out, or that's when they're agreeing to move out. Alterations and improvements. This is something I always make sure I let tenants know, is that they are not allowed to make any physical alterations to the interior or exterior of any unit that they live in. I had a tenant one time in a townhouse who decided to cut a hole in the kitchen wall between the kitchen and the living room. And I'm going to tell you that he did a very, very nice job. Put a nice kitchen countertop in, put some new cabinets and countertops in the kitchen. And he had lived there for about 5 years and lived there for about another 3 years after that. But the fact that he altered the property that I owned without asking was a big surprise when I went in there. But what I did was I put this clause into my rental agreement saying that I wanted to make sure that if anybody else had some alteration issue that they wanted to try and do to a property, that they would have to get approval from the owner or from the manager. Compliance. Tenants need to comply with all the owner's rules and guidelines and any governing bodies. So like the police and the fire department, cities have rules and regulations, right? There's standard lease terms that tenants need to, I always equate it to this. As a tenant, there's no schooling or education that tenants get. When we go to school, they never teach us about how to rent or how to buy property or anything about real estate, really. So as a landlord or an owner, your job is to give some rules, give some regulations, and teach your tenant your guidelines and your standards. And you want them to comply with those issues. Maintenance and repairs. How do you want your tenant to respond? You know what? I always want my tenants to tell me if a faucet is leaking or if there's a drain under a sink leaking. You know, I had a unit one time where the tenant had a leaky faucet, and all they needed to do was call me. I could have come out and repaired the faucet, repaired the leak, but it leaked for 18 months. And at the time of them moving out, the cabinet where the kitchen sink was in and the leak was had a bow in the bottom base that I had to replace the entire cabinet because of the mold and the deterioration of the wood in the cabinet from the leak. And a $150 repair now cost me $2,000 as a result of having to change out that cabinet, do some new plumbing, and just some ordinary maintenance that would have corrected something. But the tenant was afraid that it was their responsibility and that they would be charged for it. Rightfully so, I understand that, but if I would have maybe as an owner explained to them a little bit more up front, might not have had that issue. Access is really important. Make sure your tenants know that as the landlord, you have the right to access their unit with a 48-hour notice. You could post that notice on the front door, or you can send it to them electronically. But if a tenant calls and they say, hey, you have an issue and you need to get in there with a service guy, you need to make those arrangements up front and say, hey, we're coming in on Tuesday. If tenants don't want you in their unit, that's their right, but they need to be there at your availability, not at their availability. So if you said, hey, I'm coming in Tuesday at 10, your tenant needs to make sure that they're there. Property upkeep. You know, when I turn a unit over to a tenant, they get all new blinds on the windows, all the light bulbs work, the place is clean. I expect the tenant to keep it in the same condition. Have you ever driven through a parking lot of an apartment complex and you've got broken blinds and flags hanging in windows and towels hanging up, covering windows up? I hate that look. It gives a very bad visual feeling and effect to the entire unit or entire complex. So always make sure that my tenants know that they're responsible for those items and those things. If they're not in the same condition that they were when I rented the unit to them, that they would change those and make them, turn them back to what they should be. Smoking's a personal issue, right? As an owner, you have the right to tell your tenant whether or not your unit is smoking or non-smoking. I've had buildings and complexes that were non-smoking buildings. I've had floors in complexes that were non-smoking buildings. And, you know, it's always based on, if you feel that you have a good tenant and they smoke, you know, how are you going to deal with that? Are you okay with it? Or are you not okay with it? The long-term effects of smoking in a unit are damaging. So you have to be careful of how you treat your property, or as a manager, what your owner wants. It's like mold. Mold is a big issue, right? I have found that mold are these pores that continually grow, and unless they're prevented and taken care of up front, you could wind up with problems and challenges along the way. I always make my tenants aware of the fact, hey, look, let me know if there's some mold. We'll come in, we'll remediate it right away if we need to, or make sure that you're cleaning it with some bleach and taking care of it and keeping it at a minimum, because black mold can be poisonous, and the effects of any type of mold problems or issues on the backside can be more dangerous and more costly than if you fix them up front. Plumbing. Now, how many people have had an issue with plumbing where a tenant moves in and they've got a couple of young children and somebody decides to drive a tractor down the toilet or drop a battery down a bathroom sink, or a baby diaper gets flushed down the toilet? Always make sure that my tenants know that the first time is on me. The second time, if it's something that they caused, that sewer rotting would be their problem. Grease, diapers, sanitary napkins, things like that cause issues, right? That becomes the tenant's responsibility. Let's talk about pest control for a minute. Pest control, I will warranty for the first 30 days a tenant moves in that there's no bugs, there's no problems, there's no issues. But after that first 30 days, the tenant is on their own. If there's bugs and there's problems and issues, it's generally, in my experience, has been because the tenant either brought it with them or has manifested since the tenant moved in. Condemnation. Let's just say, and I had this happen once, let's say the city zoning is deciding that they're going to take a little bit of extra road through eminent domain, and they're going to widen the street out front of your property or your complex, and they need to take a building from you, or it's going to cause parking problems, and a tenant is directly affected by that. It is not your responsibility as the owner. It's that becomes an issue between that government agency that's running that eminent domain situation and the tenant. So you still have the right, if the tenant moves out, you still have the right to collect. They can't move out for eminent domain. Damage by fire or natural causes. I had a friend one time say that the best investment he ever made was the building that burned down, right? Because the insurance company paid out his rental claims every month for that building that didn't exist there anymore until he had it rebuilt. But even as a result of damage by fire or natural disaster, a tenant cannot come after you for disturbing their situation. I've had a tenant, we had a building one time in Ohio that burned down, and we had tenants come after us or try to sue us because they got displaced as a result of the fire. Well, it wasn't our fault that the fire happened, and that by the tenant moving out, they had a hard time finding another place to live, and they tried to sue us. So we wrote this into the contract or to our lease agreement at that point, that because of a natural disaster, you can't come after us. It's not our fault. And default, this is just a clause that allows the landlord to recover the property and any fees owed as a result of the tenant's neglect. Holdover. Holdover is when a tenant needs to give up a property for possession and they decide not to. So their lease is up and they decide to be there for a few days. Typically, my lease states that if the lease is up and you decide to stay there, you're going to pay me an extra $100 a day for the time that you're living there. And if you are there any longer past X, whatever that X date might be, it's even a larger charge. And those will stand up in court, because if a tenant has decided not to re-up their lease and you as a landlord have decided not to extend their lease, they are obligated to move out on the lease ending date. Liability. This eliminates any loss to the landlord, basically stating that the tenant is not allowed to legally go after the tenant or after the landlord for any of the losses. Abandonment. I always like this issue. I had a tenant who decided to go out of the country for about 30 days and never tell me about it. I never knew if the property was abandoned, if somebody still lived there, if they were ever coming back. I actually didn't know if somebody died in the place. So we went in with the police. We found out that, nobody was in there, but that, the tenant just wasn't around. So now I have a stipulation in my lease that states abandonment. If the property's left vacant for 14 days and I didn't know that the tenant was going to be gone, I consider the property abandoned. I make sure that I go over this point with a tenant at lease signing, have them sign in the margin so that they know how important just this piece is. Always go over the notices or delivery of notices with people. Evictions are a separate issue, the way that that gets handled. But if I have to give a tenant a notice, a late fee notice, a move out notice, a lease renewal notice, I always put how I can deliver that. I can either post it on the door or I can serve it electronically. And then right of entry, again, we kind of talked about that a little bit earlier. Subordination. The lease comes second to all mortgages. So I want my tenants to know and be aware of the fact that my mortgage holder or lien holder comes before the tenant does. So if there's ever an issue or a foreclosure or a situation like that, the tenant can't come back after you because of neglect of paying the mortgage, because the mortgage comes first. And then I wanted to, these other couple of points I wanted to talk a little bit about, but there's different disclosures that should get signed at lease signing also. But there's a lead-based paint rider that's required by most states and most counties today that a tenant sign. Any properties built prior to 1978 probably have lead in them somehow, either in the pipes or in the paint. And, you know, most cases today, though, a lot of that's been encapsulated, but the FHA or HUD, Housing and Urban Development, wants tenants to be aware of this. So at lease signing, you're supposed to give your tenants a EPA and pamphlet about lead, about mold, about radon, all issues that come up. And these are things that your tenant needs to be made aware of. Other terms and provisions. And I always talk about this because what else do you want your tenant to be responsible for? Pets? Are you charging a pet deposit? Are you charging a monthly fee for a pet? How about if a resident loses a key? I had a resident call me one time, and we had in the lease that there was a fee to come and unlock the door, and then there was a fee to provide a new key for them. But the tenant seemed to overlook that in the lease. So what we did was I was on the phone with her and I said, sure, I will come out. I'll be there in about 40 minutes. But when I come out, you need to give me $75 cash for the trip charge. And then it's going to be $25 for each replaced key. She goes, let me call you back. And I kid you not, in 10 minutes, she called me back, said, I found my keys. So, you know, people become very responsible when there's a monetary figure involved, and they tend to, they will tend to find their keys pretty quickly. Residents agree not to have barbecue equipment on patios or balconies above the first floor. And I always talk to people about that because it's so easy for a barbecue to get out of hand on a tenant, especially a gas one. You could wind up with bigger challenges. Residents do not install any TV dishes or TV antennas on the side of a building or hanging off a balcony. I don't like to see that. Residents are required to have quiet enjoyment in the property and not bring any loud music or have complaints from neighbors about music or parties in their units or in the parking lot. Have you ever driven through an apartment complex, maybe in the evening or late afternoon or on the weekend, and they got trunks of cars open and the bass music playing and they're drinking beers in the parking lot? Not the kind of place that I really like to run, much less would buy. So you need to make sure as an owner or as a landlord, you keep a handle on your tenants. You don't want tenants storing any flammables or any explosives on your properties. Illegal drugs, that's a whole nother issue. One of the things that I always talk about is a crime and a drug addendum. And you'll see when I get to the addendum page that that's one of the addendums. I have about 50 different ones. But the crime and the drug page addendum is about 3 pages long. And what it basically states is that any tenant that's caught manufacturing or selling illegal drugs or distribution, trafficking, and we have the right as an owner to evict them within 30 days of them getting in trouble. The hold harmless holds you and the tenant harmless from each other, where if there's a problem or an issue, let's say the tenant goes home and beats up a neighbor, and the neighbor tries to sue you, and you're not responsible for that issue. So you're basically, that hold harmless is holding you harmless from that event or events like that. When we talk about the entire agreement, that means that when the tenant signs this agreement and you as the landlord sign this agreement, everything in the agreement is agreed upon. Not just one thing or another thing, and nothing's left out, but everything's agreed upon. It's legalese, right? And that's what the judges like to see if you wind up in federal housing court. The last page is where we really sign, and we want to make sure that these signatures line up with the names on the front page, right? We want to know how many people are going to live in your unit. The guarantor is the person who's guaranteeing the rent. That might be a co-signer. That could be the tenant that's moving in. But this is the individual that is going to be guaranteeing that rent. And then the bottom is information. You always want to get as much information as you possibly can from the tenant. Mom and dad's phone number, a cousin, a brother, an employer. Because if the tenant ever skips out, you want to be able to do a skip trace. Did you ever have a tenant that was a couple of months late on their rent, and you call their mom and you go, hey, you know, I'm looking for Tony. Tony has been living in my place and I haven't seen him in a couple of weeks, and he's actually a couple of months behind on rent. And the mom will typically go, what? Let me get a hold of him for you. So it's very interesting when you have enough information how you can circle back and try and get the tenant's attention from somebody else in their life. And up front, when you're signing that lease, it's easy to get that information. Deposits, addendums, and riders are the last piece here. And like I said, I have about 55 different addendums and riders that I packaged up. And they're all things that I've used over the years. Some you'll use, some you won't use. They're all good conversation points, though, from a standpoint of what's important. You know, you've got deposits, the drug and crime rider, employment verifications, right? You have to have a tenant sign that in order to get verification, be able to call their employer and get that verification. Pet riders, eviction notices. So there's a plethora of things that you can work through, use on your own or not use. So what I wanted to do is see if anybody had any questions right now. So if you do, go ahead and unmute yourself, and let's see if we can get those answered for you. Go ahead, V.
Well, I recently had a tenant call me saying, hey, my unit stinks it just smells like weed. And it's not us in the unit that's consuming, but it's coming from somewhere in the building. And I was really puzzled because the units don't share ducts or anything like that. Each unit has its own, you know, heating and air conditioning. So I couldn't decipher how this smell was seeping into their unit, but at the same time, being that it's legal in Illinois, it was kind of a tricky situation for me. How would you have dealt with that?
Yeah, you know, a year ago, I might have given you a different answer, but because it is legal today, you know, it's like somebody coming home and saying, hey, I smelled tequila in the hallway, right? you really, what can you do? It's legal, and if your tenant is being responsible, you know, that whole crime and drug rider these days for using pot, you can't get in trouble for it. Now, other drugs, yes, you can still, and then there's that trafficking event. But you know, unless you have a no smoking policy in your building for, you know, cigarettes or extracurricular, I don't know if it's even an issue that you can bring up. And you know, there's a guy on the call, Carl. I just would reach out to you for a minute. Do you have any thoughts around that? And I only ask because of your involvement in that industry, right?
Yeah, That's a very tricky one because, every state is a little bit different with regard to what they consider legal and off the list type stuff. I mean, some states it's you have to have a medical card. You can't, a lot of people think, oh, it's just a free for all, you can smoke whatever you want. But that is a tricky one. I would just suggest doing some research maybe on Google, for your particular state, because I'm sure that the legislature has addressed that somehow. But I think your suggestion of, if it's a no smoking building, then that's smoking of any kind, cigars, cigarettes, marijuana, whatever. But that's a little bit of a tricky one that's new, obviously new in the last 12, well, since 12, 18 months.
Right, right. So,
Well, like you said, it could be for medicinal purposes, and I'm not aware of it. And, a tenant's not required to tell you what medicines
right.
consuming. Yeah, it was a tricky one. So I had to kind of dance around the whole thing with my upstairs tenant to tell him, listen, this is the situation. I'm getting complaints from the first floor. I'm not sure if it's coming from your unit, but if you partake, can you just tone it down? And again, I don't know if you are or where it's coming from, but I kind of had to do a nice little dance there to not, infringed on them.
Yeah, well, one suggestion is when you run into situations like that, you can put out a blanket standard statement and send it to everybody, that's just, addressing the particular issue, and that could diffuse, somebody getting defensive, with you and say, well, what do you mean, who said it was me type of thing, where you just put a general notice, to all tenants, you know what I mean?
Good idea. Yeah, it just so happens that the two back tenants it's just the way the structure of the building is just totally almost separate. So I knew it couldn't have been coming from there, but I understand what you're saying. It's almost like at work, right? You want to not single out any particular person. So a good idea. I'll definitely try that going forward. Thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah, great question too. I would imagine in some context, it probably gives a little bit of some challenges in some situations, right? So,
Mike, I have a question, but if somebody else has a question, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Carl. You're all right.
Yeah. So, with regard to the lease and regularly, you told the story about the person that for 18 months let the drip, and we've all had that scenario. Do you think it's a good idea to put in the lease that says, we're going to come in maybe every 6 months, on a regular basis, just to do a walkthrough to make sure you don't have any, loose fittings under the sink or the toilet, or, change your light bulbs? I mean, is that anything you've ever put in a lease?
It is. And, you can always put in your lease, you have the right to inspect. If you have questions about a tenant or condition, you can say, hey, I'm going to come in for a quarterly inspection or a semi-annual inspection. If you feel that the tenant's going to be good, you might not want to do an inspection. I know I tell the story where I moved a family in to a property that I had just finished rehabbing. And, I had a little bit of a question about the tenant when I moved him in, and thought, so I got an extra security deposit, right? I got an extra month security deposit, and I had her pay the first and last month rent. So I had 4 months of rent, basically. Well, month 3 came around, and I'm trying to chase her 15, 20 days in for month 3's rent. And now remember, I have 2 security deposits. I go to the house, and I get there, and her 4 sons have 2 neighbor boys over. They're all sitting on the roof of the house. All the screens are kicked out. They're laying in the front lawn. The front grass is about 8 inches tall. I knew I had a problem, right? So you kind of have to be careful. You might think you're in a situation where you don't need it, but you might want to do it. But I always drive by and do a visual inspection from the outside anyhow.
Right. Do you think using language like, maintenance preventative regular maintenance is better than inspection, because I think inspection puts people back on their heels. You know what I mean?
I think language is something I learned early on in sales training, right? Never say contract, say agreement. And
Right.
I think you're kind of right about that too, that if you are talking about inspections or versus maintenance, hey, I'm going to come through every 90 days and change the furnace filter, and we're going to just check under the sinks and the faucets for you.
Yeah, that might have a different, people may look at that differently.
Right, exactly. So. Any last questions or?
I have one last question. So now with COVID and, people having a hard time making their rent payments, are you leaning more towards like a month to month? I know you said you like the 12-month lease better, but has your strategy changed at all because of all this COVID stuff?
Mine has not, and I'll tell you why my strategy is what it is, because I've kind of gone from the single family townhouse investment to the larger apartment complex investments, right? And by doing that, what you set yourself up for when you have those long-term leases is when you get ready to sell the property, investors who are buying those like to see those long-term leases in place, because it provides that sense of a business operations where you have longer term cash flow, right? You always have that 25% turnover rate every year, generally. But the investor and the bank on the funding side really want to see those long-term leases in place. Now, I'm going to let Tony, who is a advocate for month-to-month leases, talk about that a little bit, because his strategy is a little bit different than mine. So, Tony, you want to share your philosophy behind that?
Can you hear me, Mike? Sorry, it took me a while to unmute myself. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, got it. Yeah, so
Yeah.
when we first started this, we put people on year leases because the banks, that's what they wanted, because a lot of them I had a couple commercial mortgages up front for some blanket mortgages, and they use the income approach, so they wanted to see these year leases. But what we found out pretty quick was that the person was at least in our situation, they were there 2 or 3 months and they just couldn't pay the lease. They would leave. And I could, even if I were to get a judgment for 9 months, which I couldn't, they couldn't pay it anyway. So in my situation, that coupled with we can get rid of people should we want to for any reason, with a 30-day notice in their bond. And we do that, I want to say routinely, but several times a year. It's important because we have so many houses in such a small area. We want to make sure they get along with the police, the neighborhoods, the schools. And if they're disrupting, or like Mike said, if you have people sitting on the roof, 6 or 7 people sitting on the roof with the screens gone, that's hurting the community and the neighbors. And with the year lease, you may have a problem getting them out if they're paying the rent. And there's a lot of times in my situation, I could care less about the rent. I want the property to be in good shape and keep with the community. So for our little position that my wife and I have, the single family homes, the month-to-month lease works just fine. And I just talked to my wife about it just recently, and based on the call we had recently, and I believe our average tenant stays over 5 years, maybe even 5.5 years in our single family home. So we don't have a lot of turnover.
Yeah. So, I think different markets and different philosophies, different investors have different philosophies. I think, V, what it boils down to is you deciding what you want to do and setting your own standard for that. I'm real big when I coach my clients. I teach them about setting standards and how those standards are really important, because that's what we live and die by, right? Let's just talk about one issue. Let's talk about fair housing, which is something we didn't even cover tonight, and I cover that in a whole nother issue. But fair housing, you have to treat each tenant the same. So it's really important as an owner, operator, landlord, that you write clear standards for your operation. What's approvable for a credit score when you are, approving a tenant. What kind of income do you want that tenant to have? Those different standards, how long your lease term is, utilities, all those standards, you want to have them written, because if any fair housing issues ever come up and you wind up in housing court as a result of it, you want to be able to show the judge, hey, look, I have this written out, and this is how I practice, and this is how I conduct my business. All of my tenants follow the same processes. So it keeps you out of the crosshairs of getting in trouble because you cut your standards or did something different for somebody else.
Hey, Mike, I had one comment I thought was you had a paragraph in there about your prorations of the rent.
Sure.
And we do it just a little bit differently. I'll get your thoughts on it. So in the example of the 15th of the month, we still have the rent due the first, but what we always do is we always charge a full month's rent and we prorate the second month.
Oh, you do? Yeah, that's interesting.
This way we get all the rent up front, full month's rent plus security deposit.
So if I move in on the 15th, you're charging me a full month at that point?
Right, so I'm charging you from the 5th. So let's say the rent's $1,000. I'm charging you $1,000 rent on the 15th.
Okay.
But number 2 on the first, you only have to pay $500. So we're prorating the second month.
Interesting.
Just gives us the money up front.
Sure. You ever get any pushback on that?
Not a bit, no. And in fact, what we'll often get is we'll have people say, you know what, it's only $300. Let me just pay next month's rent too. It's at the lease signing.
Huh. Yeah. It's, again, I think sometimes those issues are market driven, right? So let me ask you this. Are you the only one that does it like that in your market, or do they do it the same way other owners and landlords too?
I think most of them do it the way you described.
The way I described?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So that's interesting. So it's good though, Tony. That's one thing I always liked about you is you're out of the box a little bit,
Well, I'll tell you one of the reasons we started doing it was because when I first got into this business, when I was too dumb and I took a check for moving and it bounced, That was lesson number 1. The lesson number 2 is they moved in on, I prorated the rent for the first month, so even had the check cleared, I was only getting a small amount of the rent. So I learned 2 valuable lessons with one bad experience.
Yeah, right. Well, let me close this out real quick and then we'll keep discussing, but I just wanted, the last slide here is just my contact information, my core intentions, and you can reach me at mike@mycoreintentions.com. Join us on Saturday morning where Carl, who's on the call this evening, and I co-host a show called Multifamily Unplugged, where we talk to industry leaders. We discuss techniques and strategies for buying and operating multifamily apartments. And over the term, we're gonna interview many of the top leaders in the industry. So join us on Saturday mornings at 10 a.m. for some multifamily radio, and we'll give some raw data and some raw information. One of the big things we're going to talk about on that show is what's happened over the past week nationally in the industry, and what kind of things should we be looking for as owner operators. So if anybody has any questions and they want to reach out, if you want a copy of this lease, please email me and I'd be more than happy to send you a copy of it. Like I said, it is not gospel and you want to go to your own attorney and have them check it. But I look forward to talking to you, and if there's anything I can do, don't hesitate to give me a call.
Mike, what's your email?
Mike@mycoreintentions.com.
Thanks.